All right. Well, we get to take a little bit of a different direction in our Bible survey just because we're entering into what is a very small book compared to what we've encountered thus far in our series, right? We've done the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, we've done Joshua and Judges, all pretty long books, right? And now we come to the book of Ruth, which is just a mere 4 chapters. And so we will actually get to spend probably more time in the text covering more ground in a book of the Bible because the book is so short. And so I hope you walk away understanding the power of such a small book. And one of the things that I love about the book of Ruth is because it is this small story in the midst of this huge, grand narrative that God is telling among his people, Israel. And yet, what he has done is he's zeroed in on this one family, right? And a foreign woman brought into this Israelite family, and it highlights the faithful love of God. But we've been kind of big out here dealing with the people of Israel. Now we're going to zoom in on one family. But there's an immense truth for us to receive and to embrace here about the character of God in the small things. We serve a God who is the God of the big things and the small things. And I want you to know that means for us who have individual lives, and we have many of us, we consider our lives to be pretty mundane and pretty common and small. We're not on the geopolitical sphere of the world doing this or that. We're not movers and shakers when it comes to news headlines. That's not us. It's small and it's common and mundane, and yet God is in that too. He's the God of the big and the small. And he uses seemingly small stories to tell wonderfully impactful stories in his grand narrative of him highlighting his glory through a people that he's chosen to save through Jesus Christ. And so we come with that kind of overarching theme and introduction to the book of Ruth. But if you look there at your handout, you can see with me just a few things to get us into the context of this book. The Bible does not tell us who the author of Ruth is, but Jewish tradition believed it to be Samuel. Now, that's not certain, however. And the book is called Ruth after one of the main characters, right? A very important character, but I'm going to tell you in just a minute why I think that the book's probably, under God, more about somebody else than it is about Ruth, okay? So if we go on here in the title and date and time section, we see that we don't know exactly when the book was written, but since the genealogy that comes at the very end of the book of Ruth ends with David, we know it was at least written at the time when David was rising in prominence in Israel after he was anointed as the king who would follow Saul. But it could have been written much later. We don't exactly know. But we know it had to be at least at that time when he was rising in prominence as king over Israel. Now, what about the historical context? Look with me at Ruth chapter 1. Ruth chapter 1, right after the book of Judges in your Old Testament. Verse 1 reads, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." That gives you the setting historically for where we are in the timeline of the Old Testament, in the days when the judges ruled. So this is the time that Pastor Ben unpacked for us last week in the book of Judges. The time after the leadership of Joshua and before the establishment of kingly rule in Israel, starting with Saul. It lasted approximately 160 years. And as we learned last week, the judges were not what we typically think of as a judge today. It wasn't a judge like a Supreme Court judge, right, or a municipal court judge or something like that. No, James McCowan in his commentary on Ruth says that they were military heroes, defenders of the people against those who oppressed them. So they were military leaders. They were not what we think of judicially as a judge. The time of the judges was a time that was marked by a great deal of unfaithfulness. That was a big part of what we learned last week from Pastor Ben. God's people were extremely unfaithful during this time. We looked at last week Judges 17 and 21 and the idea that there was no king in Israel at that time and everybody did what was right in their own eyes, right? Because there was not a king, people just gave free rein to their flesh. And it got, especially that last part of the book of Judges we saw last week, things got really crazy. The book is characterized, the time of the Judges, we should say, is characterized by a continuous cycle of rebellion, oppression, repentance, deliverance, and then the cycle repeats, right? Rebellion, oppression, repentance, deliverance, and then rebellion again, and it starts over. That's the historical context that we're in. Now, here's the wonderful thing about the book of Ruth, is that against that backdrop of the book of Judges and all of that unfaithfulness, all of that rebellion, we have this very sweet story of God's faithfulness for this little family in Israel. And so, again, the God of the big and the small, but also we should not look at the time of the Judges and think that God's grace and his loving kindness were absent. They absolutely weren't. We saw that not only in the fact that he would deliver his people Israel whenever they repented, but now we see it in this beautiful story of him highlighting his loving kindness in this family and what happens with them in this little chunk of time in Israelite history. Let's think about this structure here. Now, we could get down into the nitty-gritty a lot more with the structure of the book of Ruth, but I just broke it up into the chapters that we already find and kind of gave it like a good summary statement for each of these chapters. Chapter 1, you're going to find God's faithful love against a dark backdrop. And I've already kind of told you a little bit about that with the fact that the backdrop would be the time of the Judges, with lots of unfaithfulness for the people of God. God's faithful love against a dark backdrop. But there's more that we'll get into about that dark backdrop here in a few minutes. Now, chapter 2 would be God's faithful love in everyday circumstances. And the reason why I put everyday circumstances there is because you start to see God working providentially, right? Not miraculously, but providentially, and how his faithful love is shown in the common and the ordinary, okay? Chapter 3, God's faithful love overcoming obstacles. Okay, so you have there this bold kind of marriage proposal on the part of Ruth, overcoming an obstacle to having both she and Naomi redeemed, right? So that they are protected and they're secure with Boaz, as we'll talk about more, and his care. Chapter 4 is God's faithful love in bringing redemption. And we see kind of the story come to a 180, if you will, with redemption being brought to Naomi, Ruth, and how, if we step back, we actually get to see that it's on a much larger scale than we actually thought it was at the beginning of the book. Okay, so those are probably some good summary statements. And if you notice, I put God's faithful love at the beginning of each of those statements for each of the chapters. And that's important because at the core of the meaning of the book of Ruth is this Hebrew word, hesed. I think I heard you say it a few weeks ago when we were talking about 1 Peter. Hesed, right? This, and you kind of used some phlegm when you said it, I think, if I remember correctly. And so it's this idea that God is a committed God of love. It's his faithful love, his loyal love toward his people. And so we see this come out time and time again in the book of Ruth. Now, we're going to jump now into the text as we walk through these different themes, and we're going to be looking at some of these important texts along the way so we can see the story of Ruth and actually how it fits into the larger story of the Bible. Okay, so first of all, let's begin in chapter 1. It starts by talking about this one particular family. I'm just going to read verses 1 through 5. And we're going to see why this backdrop that is set is so important for God's faithful love being highlighted in this story. Verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So, I think, obviously, like all of these books, the main character is God, right? Highlighting his faithful, loyal love. He's the hero. He's always the hero in the Bible. We can always give that Sunday school answer whenever someone says, "What's this book about?" And you can say, "Oh, it's about God." He's the one highlighted. It's about him. It's about his glory. But underneath God, I do think that the story is more about Naomi than it is Ruth. It starts here talking about Naomi's family. And Naomi has lost much. And so if we consider these first several verses here, I want to show you the fact that, first of all, this Israelite family, right, they're in Bethlehem, but they leave because there's a famine in the land, right? So Elimelech, the husband, leads Naomi and his 2 sons to Moab. Now, the Moabites were enemies of God, Gentiles and enemies of God. He leads them into this land. Now, there's debate as to whether or not that was disobedient of Elimelech to do that, to leave Israel, leave the promised land, and go to Moab, to the enemies of God, and sojourn there. It says they remained there. I tend to think that was a disobedient act for Elimelech, to lead his family to remain there. And so he dies, and also his 2 sons die, but not before they took these Moabite wives. Now we also know something that would have been wrong for them, to take foreign wives. That was a no-no for the people of Israel because of the influence, like Solomon, right? Like we see later on with Solomon, who had these foreign wives and they drew his heart away from the Lord. This would have been a no-no for both of these Hebrew men. And so there is, many believe, but not all, that there is an element of judgment here because of a disobedient choice on the part of Elimelech. I tend toward that view for that reason. Naomi now is left without husband, without her 2 sons, but now she's got these 2 daughters-in-law, okay? And we see God use these 2 wives that really shouldn't have been sought in the first place, but yet God redeems by using them for his glory in the story of this family. Okay, so we see that dark backdrop there. That's our first theme of the book, is God's loving kindness toward his people amid extreme hardship. Now, what's the hardship we're talking about? Specifically, when it comes to Naomi, the fact that she has lost her family. She's lost her blood relatives, her husband and her 2 sons. And so there's this whole part of chapter 1 where she's going to return back to Bethlehem, but her daughters-in-law want to go with her. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but she tries to convince them to stay, to go back to their country, go back to Moab. Well, I want you to look with me at verse 13 in particular, okay? And to get the beginning of this sentence, we'll back up a little bit into verse 12. She's trying to convince them not to go with her, right? And so she says, if you like halfway through verse 12, if I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. That's important for understanding the main theme of this book. She's saying, listen, even if I were to have a husband and I were to get pregnant now, are you going to wait for my children, my sons, to grow up to be old enough for you to marry them? She's trying to convince them that it's absurd for them to return to her with her to Bethlehem, right? And so she ends up saying, though, something very important. She believes that the hand of Yahweh, the hand of God, has gone out against her. And so she hasn't stopped believing in God. She sees God as sovereign, but she believes that the hand of God is against her by taking from her her husband and her two sons. That's the way she sees it. We see something similar in the same chapter in verses 20 and 21. This is what she returns. She comes back with Ruth. She's actually in Bethlehem now, and the women that are there, they say, is this Naomi? When she comes back, in verse 21, she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? See, the name Naomi, and you can see this in your footnotes if you have a cross-reference Bible, Naomi means pleasant. But she says, call me Mara, because Mara means bitter, right? She looks at God and she says, he has dealt bitterly with me. And even using courtroom language, the Lord has testified against me. The Almighty has brought calamity upon me. So she is in a place where she is in bitter distress. She is empty, so to speak, the emptiness of losing her family members. And so that becomes very important for us as we look at chapter 1 and we see what happens in the end, what God does in Naomi's life to highlight his faithful love and then bring her to a different place at the end of the book of Ruth. And so take note of Naomi's emptiness. Now, if you look on the back there, you'll see that God is going to show his love. He's going to show his loyal, faithful love to Naomi through Ruth. Okay, so look with me at verses 16 and 17 back in chapter 1. Okay, so the two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. Orpah decides after some convincing from Naomi, she's going to return back to her people. Right? She's going to go back to Moab. She's not going to go to Bethlehem with the other two ladies, with Naomi and with Ruth. But Ruth, she decides, I'm going to stick with my mother-in-law. And so we read this in verse 16. Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. That is one of the most dense, beautiful words of commitment in all of Scripture. And this is coming from a Moabite woman. It reminds me of what we talked about a little bit on Sunday with regard to the centurion, the Gentile who said, Lord, just speak the word, right, from a distance and my servant will be healed. And Jesus says, oh, wow, I haven't seen faith like that in Israel. And yet you, the Gentile, are exhibiting that kind of faith. So I see that kind of distinction here. We've got this Moabite woman and this wonderful love and commitment she has to her mother-in-law. And it's not just about Naomi, because she says, your God will be my God. She's turning away from the false god of the Moabites, Chemosh, turning to Yahweh. Turning from all hope of marrying within her people. She's going to a place that she doesn't know. The only person she knows is Naomi. Completely fresh. She's committing. She's saying, I'm going to die there. I'm going to be buried with you. Just know that. And so she kind of pronounces this commitment by saying, basically, may the Lord do so to me. May he take me out. May he destroy me. May he kill me. If anything but death parts me from you. So it's like an oath she's making here before God to stick to Naomi and Naomi's God, which is now her God, Yahweh. So this is Naomi's great benefit. But here's the thing. She doesn't see it that way yet. She doesn't see it that way yet. In verse 18, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. She's like, oh, thank you so much. Yes, I need you. There's nothing like that. She said, okay, fine. If you're going to be stubborn about it, I'll let you come. But she doesn't see the great gift from Yahweh that Ruth is for her life at this point. So look with me at chapter 2. We also see just continued love from Yahweh to Ruth. I don't want you to zero in on Ruth and say, look how great Ruth is. I want you to step back and say, look how great God is to give Naomi Ruth. That's the way we should see it, right? Now, chapter 2, verse 2, they're back in Bethlehem. And just imagine, and this is in a patricentric culture where women depended on men for their sustenance and their survival, okay? There was no government assistance for them. So you have now Ruth who comes back with Naomi. Naomi's older, Ruth is younger, obviously, and she sees it as important to take care of providing for them in some sense. And so in verse 2, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, and whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. There's this provision that God made in the law when it came to barley, right, and the crops, that as they were gleaning, as they were actually getting the harvest, a lot of the barley would fall to the ground, and God said, don't pick that up. Leave that for people. Leave that for the needy. Leave that for the people who are destitute. And so what's happening is Ruth is going to go, and she's going to pick up, and she's going to go glean the barley that's left over from them harvesting so that they can survive. It's basically eking by, right? Like eking out a living. That's what she's going to be doing. But she's going to do it because of her care for her mother-in-law. Okay? So again, this is God's love through Ruth. Now look at verse 11. Boaz recognizes what a gift that Ruth is to Naomi. Boaz answered, verse 11, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. He knows about it. It's been told to him. He recognizes what a gift she is to Naomi. And then we see in chapter 3, verse 9. I want to show you something. This is that kind of strange marriage proposal that I was telling you about. We'll get into that more in chapter 3. Ruth essentially proposing marriage to Boaz. And we read this. He wakes up, who are you? Verse 9. And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Now, what you need to know about that is that she's essentially saying, I want you to be used by God to give security and care to me, but not only me, but Naomi. Because Boaz is related to Elimelech's family, right? Which is Naomi's dead husband, okay? And so by recognizing him as a redeemer, Ruth is saying, I want you to redeem both of us, right? My mother-in-law and me. It's not just about her. Ruth's not looking out for number one. She's thinking of her mother-in-law and wanting her to be protected and cared for as well moving forward. Now look at chapter 4, verse 15. We get to the end of the book here, and this is what we read. The women there in Bethlehem, they recognize something very important about Ruth. In verse 15, we read this: he shall be to you. This is Ruth's son, okay? It's been born to her by Boaz. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For, listen, your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. What a gift Ruth is to Naomi. Better to you, more important for you than 7 sons. This daughter-in-law who loves you. Now, Naomi, back in chapter 1, though, she doesn't see how important Ruth is yet. Right? She doesn't see how important Ruth is yet. But God's love is being shown to Naomi in her brokenness, in her emptiness, in her distress, having lost her family. God has sent her this Gentile daughter-in-law that ends up being this wonderful provision of faithful love to her. Now, God also loves through Boaz. God's love through Boaz, we see that, and it's essentially God's love given through Boaz to Ruth, and then that overflows onto Naomi. So again, I think Naomi is kind of the person that is the main character under God here, all right? So let's look at God's love through Boaz. Chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Now, this is after Ruth is in Boaz's field, and she's gleaning. Boaz doesn't know her. He's only heard about her. But that very day, this is what we read about his kindness to her. Verse 8. And Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter. And by saying that, it's likely that he's much older than her, okay? My daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. He's caring for her. Stay in this field. Stay in my field. He wants her to be protected in this, though he doesn't know her, and though she's this foreign woman. Look with me at verse 12. Now this is essentially a prayer. He recognizes how good she's been to her mother-in-law, and he says this in verse 12, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now, first of all, that's a statement of the fact that she has come under God's grace and under his protection. God is her refuge. She is a woman of faith in Yahweh. She is saved in that sense, right? And so he says, under whose wings, that's God, under God's wings, you've come to take refuge. But this is interesting. He says, this is the prayer, may the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord. What's funny is he's praying that prayer, but he doesn't recognize at this point that he is the answer to that prayer. Because he ends up redeeming the family, right? And making sure that not only will they have the line moving forward, and Ruth will have this son, this child, and Naomi will be filled again, but at the same time, they'll be secure, be protected, moving forward, cared for. And he doesn't yet see that he's the answer to that prayer for this family. So God's love through Boaz. Verses 14 through 16, you think that same day that the grace and the love of God is over with for Ruth? It's not. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also, pull out some from the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. Basically saying, let's just take some out and throw it on the ground, okay, guys? All right? So she's got more that she can glean. He's taking care of her. He just met her, right? What love. And he's saying, eat, eat, eat until you're satisfied. And then she takes all the leftovers home. It says that, verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until evening, then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now, that's somewhere between, scholars say, 28 to 50 pounds. And one commentator said it's like you getting one of those gigantic bags of dog food that you have to try to carry through the store like that. That's how much barley they've got now. And it could feed them for even several weeks, some say. You see that, and again, don't let your eyes rest on Boaz, but step back and say, wow, the satisfying love of God, the providing love of God, the committed love of God for his people. And again, it's to Ruth, but it overflows upon Naomi because she goes home and shares all this with her mother-in-law. So God shows love through Boaz. And then chapter 3, verses 10 through 15, there's this beautiful response from Boaz. You know, she's there. She goes and uncovers his feet, if you remember the story. And there's this, basically she's saying, proposing marriage, spread your wings over me, verse 11, your servant, for you are a redeemer, verse 9. And it says there in verse 10, and he said, this is Boaz now, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. There's another family member. He says, remain tonight in the morning. If he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. And so he even tells her to lie down, and he says, well, when it's still dark, he kind of sends her away, and he even gives her more food on her way out. And he does so, I think, before the sun rises, because he doesn't want anything to happen to her. He wants her to be safe. But at the same time, he doesn't want anybody to think anything ill of her, like she was doing something that was inappropriate, right? And so he's looking out for her, and he says, I'm going to redeem you, but he's a stand-up guy. He knows legally there's another relative that's even closer to the family than he is, and he says, I'm going to go check things out with him first. And if he won't redeem you, then I will. He's doing things right. He's a man of integrity. And again, this is God's love to this family. And then chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, I won't read through all of it, but basically it's the whole account of him going to the elders of the city, and he goes to this other redeemer, this relative who's closer, and basically says, listen, there's this plot of land from Elimelech. If you want it, you can have it. You can take the land, but know that it comes with a woman. It comes with Ruth. And when he finds out it comes with Ruth, he says, I can't do that. I'm sorry. There's some trouble with his inheritance if he does that. So he gets to actually, before the elders of the city, he commits to redeeming Ruth. And thus, ultimately, Naomi as well. And so there's this wonderful track record of God's love through Boaz as well. Now, I want you to look with me at Naomi's fullness, okay? Because the story comes from her being empty, losing her family. She sees God as dealing bitterly with her. But then something happens, right? If we start reading in chapter 2, verse 19, we're going to see that Naomi recognizes something, and it seems that her heart begins to change. Verse 19, and her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And so, if you look at the text in verse 20, when she finds out that Ruth has been gleaning in the fields of Boaz, she makes this statement, right? This exclamation, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Now, commentators disagree saying, is this the kindness of Boaz or is this the kindness of Yahweh? Right? And it's hard to tell in the Hebrew whether they're talking about Boaz's kindness or they're talking about Yahweh's kindness, but I think it makes the most sense to see this as Yahweh's kindness. And so it seems that her heart is shifting. She's saying before that the Almighty has dealt bitterly with her, and now she sees that God is working on their behalf and says that his kindness is not forsaking the living or the dead, meaning them, right? Naomi and Ruth, they're the living, but the dead, right? Speaking of Elimelech and Mahlon, which was Ruth's husband. And so I think that she's referring to the kindness of Yahweh there. And again, this seems to be a shift in what's happening in her heart. Okay? Now, let's go to the last chapter, and let's look at 4:13 through 17. You get the end of this whole story, and notice the emphasis is really on Naomi instead of Ruth. Look with me at verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, okay, well, they're not going up to Ruth and saying, oh, your baby. They go up to Naomi, right? The women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. Speaking of now her grandson, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to, not Ruth, but Naomi. A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And she, again, why end off that way? Because we started out zeroing in on this family, and Naomi losing, in a human sense, everything, her family and her livelihood. And then we get the 180, the half circle around, and it's all focusing on her. And the fact that she has been given this child, yes, through Ruth, this wonderful, loving daughter-in-law, but the focus is on her. She went back to Bethlehem empty, but now, because of God's love, through Ruth and through Boaz, she is now full. And so you see in her fullness this wonderful story of God being kind against the backdrop of this horrific time in Israelite history, the time of the judges, the rebellion, and everyone doing what was right in their own eyes, and then the judgment that God was bringing upon them for their disobedient choice. And at the same time, you see God saying, I'm going to overflow your cup with this goodness because of my faithful hesed, right? My faithful love, my loyal love to you. Okay, so that's a big theme. It's a big theme. God's faithful love in the midst of devastating circumstances for his people. But then the second theme we have here is God's providence working for his good, right? For the good of his people. God's providence working for the good of his people. Look back with me at chapter 1. As we're looking back to chapter 1 for a moment, I want to remind you that providence is different than a miracle. When God works miraculously, he's breaking into the normal and ordinary processes of life, right? With something like the Red Sea, okay? The parting of the Red Sea. He's breaking in and saying, okay, what normally happens is that this water, the tide comes in, of course, when it's windy, the water gets kind of choppy. That's all very normal and ordinary. But now what he's going to do is he's going to pull back the water. And so it's like walls of water on either side so they can walk across the Red Sea on dry ground. That's a miracle. He's breaking the cycle, so to speak, of ordinary processes. But in providence, that's not the same. God's still working. He's still sovereign. But he's using the common, the everyday, right? The mundane to move things to his desired end, right? And that's what we see. That's what we know every day. And so we don't see anything miraculous happening here in Ruth. And so that's another way we can really glean ourselves glory out of this book, because this is very much something we can apply to our own lives. We don't see the miraculous happen. That's not something, we don't get to see Red Sea events and God or Jesus, multiplying the loaves and the fishes. Did I just say fishes? I don't think you can say that. I think it's just fish. The grammar police are after me. My wife would laugh. So God works in those two different ways. But when it comes to providence, right now he's working, right? I'm not seeing miracles. You haven't seen miracles today. I don't think you've seen miracles today. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think you have. But God's working in the normal things, the normal ways of you waking up this morning. You got stuck in traffic, or you encountered somebody, and there's a conversation that took place, and it was kind of funny, but it got kind of awkward. That's something normal that happens to us every week. God's working in those things in ways that we don't even realize. But we can look at a text like this. We can look at a book like Ruth and say, oh, things that seem like they don't matter, they matter in the plan of God. They matter because he's superintending every detail for his glory and the good of his people in this world. And so look with me at chapter 1, verse 6. Something that you might read over is actually something you should take as God's providence, working in the common. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, speaking of Naomi, to return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. You think, okay, that I would just read over that. I wouldn't think anything of that. But God wants to tell this story in this family, right, of faithful love. And in order to do that, they've got to be back in Bethlehem. So she's in the fields of Moab, and she hears what's going on back in Bethlehem, that God has ended the famine. She's heard about it. Somehow that information got back to her and those other ladies. People are talking, they're probably doing the same thing, gleaning in the fields, and they hear God has ended that famine. And then she decides it's time to go back to Bethlehem. But that's something that is so common, so ordinary, that we would just read past it. It's kind of like Esther, which we'll get to eventually. I'm reading through Esther in my devotional times right now, and there's this one thing that happens where it's hard to say his name. Ahasuerus, is that right? I think that's right. I think that's how you say it. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. The king, right? He can't sleep one night. I mean, we struggle with that all the time. Don't you wake up and you can't sleep, and what do you get a snack out of the fridge? We deal with that all the time. Something so normal, but because he couldn't sleep, he actually calls for his servants to bring him the book of remembrance, right? And there's this book of essentially good deeds that have been done in the kingdom. And one of the good deeds that's been done is very important for the fact that if you remember Mordecai in the story, he actually doesn't get executed, but the guy who was going to execute Mordecai gets executed because this simple thing happened, where the king couldn't sleep. And so he has this book be brought. It talks about a good deed that Mordecai did. He says, oh, that guy needs to be honored. And it leads to the salvation, at least in a physical sense, of all the Jews who were going to be wiped out. And it's just because he couldn't sleep. It all started with him not being able to sleep. And so back here in Ruth, this whole story of faithful love that's told in Bethlehem, it begins here when they just heard that the famine had ended. God was in charge of that, wasn't he? He was absolutely in charge of that little detail that brings them back to Bethlehem. Now, what else? Look with me at chapter 2. We have Ruth, and she's gone out to glean, to provide for the family. In verse 2, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now, you see those words right there? She happened to come to? Now that's important because commentators agree, the scholars agree, that's purposeful. Those words are very purposeful. This is not coincidence. They're kind of being, whoever wrote this, if it was Samuel, is being tongue-in-cheek, right? She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Isn't that funny? Like, happened to, just like, oh yeah, it was a pure coincidence that she happened to be in that field. And then in verse 4, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem at the exact same time, right? Boaz comes there, and then he asks, hey, who's this woman right here? You know what? Tell me about her. But they happen to be there at the exact moment. He comes from Bethlehem. She's in the field. God's in charge of it. And it's clear that whoever wrote this book is being a little tongue-in-cheek there and saying, of course it wasn't happenstance. This is God and his providence moving so that Ruth meets Boaz. And one thing leads to another, and they're married, and they have this child who is in the line of David, who is in the line of Christ. Right? That's our great God who uses the normal. And so you think, my life is either really hard or it's really boring. But God's using the really hard. And he's using the really boring and the mundane and the common in your life to do something, to glorify his name and to sanctify you and to conform you to Christ and to highlight his character in some glorious way. And so don't think that somehow your life doesn't matter because you're not doing certain things that you think you should be doing or hope you could be doing. Because God's at work. He's telling his story. He's building his church. And he's highlighting himself through you and through his other people collectively in this church together as well. And he's doing so through providence. Okay. We also see, and this is another part of the book, is God's inclusion of foreigners into the fold of his people. God's inclusion of foreigners into the fold of his people. Now, this is interesting. I have several verses there that you can look up on your own when you have time, but I just want to read basically a summary of each of these verses for you from the handout so you can understand who the Moabites were in relationship to the Israelites, okay? In Genesis chapter 19, the people of Moab find their roots in the incest of Lot and his oldest daughter, okay? That's where the Moabites come from, right? There's incest that takes place after Lot has come out of Sodom, right? And there's this incestuous relationship that takes place, and that's where the Moabites come from. That's where they get their origin, okay? Numbers 22 through 24, the Moabites hired Balaam to curse the Israelites, okay? Numbers 25, 1 through 9, the Moabites influenced the Israelites into false worship. Judges 3, 12 through 30, during the time of the judges, Moab oppressed Israel under Eglon, their king. And then Deuteronomy 23, because of their neglect and evil against Israel, no Moabite was allowed into the assembly of the Lord. And yet, we have Ruth. Look with me at a few different parts of Ruth. And you might just, if you've got a pen, like circle these. And that's what I've done in my Bible, just because it's important to remember that God is taking foreigners and bringing them into the fold of his people, right? First of all, verse 4 of chapter 1, these took Moabite wives, the name of the one Orpah, the name of the other Ruth, okay? But why does the author keep calling Ruth the Moabite, right? Look with me at chapter 1, verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her. He keeps calling her Ruth the Moabite. He didn't just say Ruth, like Ruth went with her. He keeps saying Ruth the Moabite. Same thing in chapter 2, verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi. And then, verse 6, and the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered to Boaz's question, she is the young Moabite woman. Then we see again, toward the end of chapter 2, verse 21, and Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, right? There it is again. And then in chapter 4, Boaz is referring to Ruth, and he calls her in verse 5, Ruth the Moabite. And then in chapter 10, also Ruth the Moabite. Why is the author referring to her that way? Because I think it's meant to again make us be astonished at the grace of God who is taking this Moabite woman, and we know that they were not allowed into the assembly of the Lord, these Moabites, and yet God is saying, she's mine, and I'm going to love her, and I'm going to have that love spill over onto her mother-in-law. I'm bringing this woman who was an outsider into the fold. Just like we saw back in Joshua with Rahab. This Gentile prostitute who gets brought into the fold because of her faith. And the faith of Ruth is exhibited so plainly in her commitment to God as she's going to now make Naomi's God her God. And so the fact that we see Ruth the Moabite, over and over and over again should lead us to say, God is so good. His love stretches beyond Israel to even his enemies, enemy nations, like the Moabites. And so we can fast forward and we see a thread in the New Testament, don't we, with texts like Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 11. Therefore remember that at one time you Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. And he came and preached peace to those who were far off and peace to those who were near. Right, we get that full orbed explanation of the fact that God's plan was always to make one people, Jew and Gentile, through faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Ruth is an example of that in the Old Testament. Well, finally, we see in terms of themes in the book of Ruth, God's preservation of the messianic line, right? The line of the Messiah. Turn back with me to our text back in chapter 4 in Ruth. Chapter 4 in Ruth. Back in Genesis, when Ben was teaching through that book several weeks ago, we saw something very important in chapter 3, verse 15 in Genesis, right? Which has been called the first gospel, right? It's the proto-evangelion, first gospel. The first hint of the gospel in the Old Testament comes as God is pronouncing curses, right? He's pronouncing curses on Satan and then the woman and the man because of their sin and eating from the tree he commanded them not to eat from. And we've got this promise that the seed of the woman would bruise the head of the serpent, right? Crush the head of the serpent, if you're reading, I think, the King James Version, which I like that. Crush the head of the serpent. So this line, this serpent crusher, this Messiah, comes from the line that starts way back there, but then through Abraham. And then now we're getting to more people in this line of the Messiah, and we see it fulfilled in Matthew chapter 1. But if you look with me at chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, this is what we find. So weird. Why would Ruth end with a genealogy? It's strange, right? Why at the very end? I mean, Matthew starts with the genealogy. It kind of makes sense. But why would Ruth end off with this little genealogy? Now, there are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. And Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David, which is the king, kind of the preeminent human king in Israel that they look to, right? Now, this small little family and this Moabite woman who ends up being in this genealogy, okay, and then the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1 of Jesus. Did you know that? Did you know that Ruth was in the genealogy of Jesus? Rahab was too, by the way. Both of those ladies in the genealogy of Christ, but it starts here in the Old Testament. We see that it starts with David. And it's important because if you're thinking about the grand narrative of the story God's telling, we started back in Genesis chapter 3. There's going to be someone who's going to defeat Satan. The seed of the woman is going to defeat Satan. And you follow this lineage all throughout the Old Testament until you get to Matthew chapter 1, and you're told it's this son of David, who is Christ. But we see this lineage carried into David here in this last part of Ruth. But then, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, there is a promise that's made in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the Davidic covenant. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 and 13, here's this promise. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, he's talking about Solomon, but then he can't just be talking about Solomon because he says, I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Solomon died. So how is his throne going to be established forever? Verse 16, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. How did that happen with a man who dies? He's speaking about Christ. And so when you read the end of Ruth, you should see, it stops with David, but then your mind should then jump to 2 Samuel chapter 7, the Davidic covenant, which then points forward beyond Solomon, the son of David, to the son of David who is Christ in Matthew chapter 1. And so, again, God is the God of the big and the small. This small little story is being told, but it's part of this huge story of God saving a people for himself through the death of his son and the resurrection of his son, right? Because Ruth, right, Boaz have Obed, the grandfather of David, right? And David ends up being the one that points forward in this very sweet text of 2 Samuel 7, this Davidic covenant, to Jesus Christ. And so it's a small story and a big story. And just practically speaking, it's true for us as well that your small story is part of God's big story. It's one big, gigantic story of history that God's telling. Now, in this sense, we're looking to the lineage of Christ. Now, for us, we're not in the lineage of Christ, but you know what? We are sons of God, aren't we? We are sons and daughters of God through faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. We are in his spiritual family because of what he accomplished through Christ. So your little story, each day, isn't it important for you to wake up and to remember that God is telling his story through your life? And it matters. It matters to God because he made you and he saved you. And he did so that you would highlight his wonderful, faithful love in your life. So what do you need to do tomorrow to make sure that you are actually living in line with that purpose? Right? How can you change your thought process? I think we should all wake up in the morning and we should tell ourselves that more often. God is telling his story through me today. That's not to highlight me, it's to highlight him, right? It's to put him on display. And my little story fits into his grand narrative. And I was reading a blog post by Randy Alcorn today, and he was talking about just kind of, using his sanctified imagination and talking about how in one day in heaven, he thinks that we're going to be sitting around and we're going to be telling stories. And God will be letting us in on little secrets here and there when it comes to how he used us in ways that we don't even know about right now. It could be. It could be that one day God's going to let us in and say, you know what? There was that time and that time and that time. Here's how I used that. Here's how I used you. You didn't even know about it, but I did this for my own glory, and I want you to know that now, and it will lead us to worship him all afresh in glory. We don't have to struggle with sin anymore. Isn't that cool to think about? ways in which you have no idea. You have no idea. Like that story I told you guys, it's probably, I don't know, it was the last series we did about that girl that was walking on the beach, and a couple of guys were there doing evangelism on the beach, and one of them just said, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ," and they just kept walking. And that led to her actually bowing the knee to Christ. She had already heard the gospel growing up, but she was rebelling against her upbringing. And she goes back to her hotel room, and she actually is convicted over sin and gives her life to Christ and surrender. That guy never knew that happened. And in our small little moments of faithfulness, he is using. And even things that we're not even choosing to do anything, there might be, you're like, okay, why would I have to sit in that traffic? Right? Do you ever sit in traffic and you're like, it would all be worth it if I got to the end of the traffic jam and I saw the reason why we were in traffic. But you get to the end, you're like, there's no reason. I don't see any reason why I had to sit in this traffic jam. But we know better than that. God's providence is at work. And he's using that somehow. We don't know. But he is. And you can say, it matters. I don't know how, but it matters. Because obviously, Ruth's not thinking about this at the time. She's just going out. She's going to go glean in the field. She happens to be there when Boaz is there. Happens to hear in the field someone talking about the fact that there's no more famine. These little things and we don't connect them to God. That's the problem. But we should connect them to God so that we learn to trust him more and glorify him more and enjoy him more. Right? Okay. Well, let me pray, and then I'll ask if there's any questions after I pray. Father God, thank you so much that you've given us this time together, and I pray that it would be